Oh, Sophie Cunningham! It happened again! The WNBA have fined her.
NBA fined me for dogs.
I'll never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll show up.
An institutional crisis is fracturing professional basketball after an outspoken star completely exposed the league's hidden double standards. When Sophie Cunningham decided to publicly break her silence regarding abysmal officiating, the WNBA command structure responded with a massive, targeted financial penalty. The establishment expected this aggressive fine to quickly silence Sophie Cunningham, but the disciplinary action completely backfired, triggering a global wave of public outrage instead. The brewing scandal exploded when fans realized that while Sophie Cunningham was being aggressively penalized for mere words, the league was simultaneously ignoring dangerous physical hits targeting Caitlin Clark. Audiences are demanding to know why the administration is desperate to suppress Sophie Cunningham while failing to protect Caitlin Clark on the hardwood. Did the league's heavy-handed attempt to quiet Sophie Cunningham inadvertently validate a toxic corporate agenda against Caitlin Clark, or is an even more sinister administrative cover-up about to be fully exposed? To understand why the professional basketball world is currently in a state of absolute meltdown, you have to look at the exact moment the corporate wall of silence fractured. For years, the WNBA has maintained an incredibly tight grip on its public image, enforcing strict disciplinary measures to ensure that players remain compliant employees rather than vocal partners. But when Sophie Cunningham took to social media to call out a systemic collapse in league standards, the established corporate hierarchy completely panicked. The controversy initially ignited when Sophie Cunningham posted a brief, sharp TikTok video that directly targeted the league's game officials.
You guys, there was this TikTok that Sophie Cunningham came up where she is lip syncing a Sabrina Carpenter song where she's kind of calling out the referees. It's just like a fun little TikTok that she did. It's literally 10 seconds long. And she commented on top of the TikTok and she said, "at some refs." And then she posted this on her other social media pages saying, "I got fined $500 for this TikTok. I don't know why this is funny to me." Like, okay, gotcha, bud. Because there's not more important things to be worried about with our league right now.
In the viral clip, Sophie Cunningham lip-synced a popular song with lyrics questioning the basic competence of the referees, overlaying the footage with a direct call-out to the officiating staff. Almost instantly, the WNBA command structure issued a swift $500 financial penalty, hoping a quick fine would sweep the brewing unrest entirely under the rug. Instead of backing down or issuing a standard, PR-vetted corporate apology, Sophie Cunningham chose to push the envelope even further. Rather than shrinking from the spotlight, Sophie Cunningham launched a brand new podcast titled Show Me Something, where she openly detailed the league's aggressive attempts to silence her voice. During the recording, Sophie Cunningham revealed how her general manager had to quietly pull her aside in front of the entire team just to deliver the news of the impending financial sanctions. The blunt honesty displayed by Sophie Cunningham on her platform quickly triggered an even harsher response from league headquarters. For her unfiltered podcast commentary, the WNBA slammed Sophie Cunningham with a secondary, much more severe $1,500 fine. This heavy-handed escalation brought the total penalties against Sophie Cunningham to a staggering $2,000, sending a chilling message throughout the locker rooms that raw candor would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Why is the league administration so incredibly terrified of a rookie podcast host sharing her honest perspective? What deeper administrative failures is the establishment desperately trying to conceal by repeatedly targeting the bank account of Sophie Cunningham? The answer goes far deeper than a few missed referee whistles. It directly involves the treatment of the sport's ultimate superstar, Caitlin Clark. As the public backlash intensified, fans began pointing out a massive, highly unsettling double standard regarding how the league enforces its disciplinary rules. Over the past 2 seasons, Caitlin Clark has been the target of unprecedented physical aggression, enduring brutal, borderline dangerous cheap shots on a regular basis. Yet, the exact same league office that moved at lightning speed to penalize Sophie Cunningham has remained completely silent while Caitlin Clark gets relentlessly targeted on the hardwood. This glaring discrepancy is precisely why the defense of Caitlin Clark mounted by Sophie Cunningham has resonated so deeply with the global sports community. On the court, Sophie Cunningham has increasingly assumed the vital role of an on-court protector, physically stepping in to defend Caitlin Clark when game officials refuse to blow the whistle. By speaking out on her podcast, Sophie Cunningham was explicitly highlighting how the refereeing staff continuously fails to protect the civil rights and physical safety of Caitlin Clark. The intense cultural weight surrounding Caitlin Clark has completely re-engineered the commercial DNA of professional women's sports. Every single night Caitlin Clark takes the floor, television ratings shatter historic records and merchandise flies off retail racks at an astronomical pace. Yet, instead of safeguarding their most valuable commercial asset, league gatekeepers appear far more interested in punishing the players who demand basic safety for Caitlin Clark. This bizarre misalignment of priorities took a highly dramatic turn when mainstream financial media outlets began entering the fray. A major national publication recently published a highly critical opinion piece questioning whether the targeted physical abuse aimed at Caitlin Clark constitutes a legitimate hostile work environment. Suddenly, the isolated referee complaints raised by Sophie Cunningham were elevated into a massive national discussion regarding labor safety and institutional integrity. But as corporate executives scrambled to control the rapidly spreading PR nightmare, the fan base executed a brilliant counter-strategy of their own. Within hours of the secondary fine being announced, passionate supporters launched independent crowdfunding campaigns to completely cover the penalties imposed on Sophie Cunningham. Digital petitions demanding absolute transparency in officiating began gaining thousands of verified signatures every few minutes, turning Sophie Cunningham into an overnight folk hero. The rapid escalation of this movement highlights a deep, historical divide between the WNBA and other major professional sports leagues. In men's basketball, legendary, outspoken icons have famously built massive cultural legacies based entirely on their brazen, unfiltered honesty toward officials. Fans actively celebrate that type of intense competitive grit, viewing it as an essential component of the authentic sports experience. Yet, the current leadership structure of the WNBA seems determined to enforce an outdated, corporate, seen but not heard, governance model. By repeatedly hitting Sophie Cunningham with aggressive financial sanctions, the administration is attempting to micromanage the natural human personalities that drive modern viewer engagement. It is a defensive strategy that is not only completely alienating the core fan base, but also actively suppressing the creative growth of the league's rising stars. Despite the immense administrative pressure building behind the scenes, sources close to the situation indicate that Sophie Cunningham has absolutely no intention of backing down. On her subsequent podcast episode, Sophie Cunningham openly mocked the league's disciplinary tactics, stating bluntly that a $500 penalty was not going to alter her perspective. This unyielding, defiant attitude has completely broken the psychological leverage that the league office typically holds over its players. With their traditional scare tactics completely failing to quiet Sophie Cunningham, high-level league executives are reportedly preparing to deploy their absolute maximum disciplinary measures. Rumors are circulating through front offices that the league commissioner is quietly drafting a secret, multi-game suspension framework specifically designed to remove Sophie Cunningham from the court entirely. If executed, this unprecedented administrative overreach would effectively trigger an all-out corporate war between the players' union and league headquarters. As the dangerous boardroom standoff reaches a critical tipping point, the true stability of the entire sports institution is hanging in the absolute balance. The establishment is beginning to realize that by attempting to bury the complaints of Sophie Cunningham, they have inadvertently amplified her message to millions of new viewers. But just as the commissioner prepared to finalize the secret suspension memo, a stunning, unannounced piece of data from a major television network landed directly on the executive desks, completely changing the math of the entire corporate conflict. The unexpected financial data from the television networks did not just alter the corporate math, it completely exposed the league's fragile business foundation. Front offices realized that the aggressive fines meant to break Sophie Cunningham were driving unprecedented traffic directly to her digital platforms. Corporate executives watched in absolute disbelief as audiences flocked to the Show Me Something podcast, converting a disciplinary action into a highly lucrative media property managed by Sophie Cunningham. The establishment's attempt to enforce absolute compliance had inadvertently handed Sophie Cunningham an entirely new mechanism of economic leverage. As the network numbers surged, the severe economic disparity behind the sanctions began facing intense public scrutiny. Analysts quickly calculated that a $1,500 penalty on a standard league salary was the structural equivalent of hitting an NBA player with a staggering $200,000 fine. This stark realization completely shifted public sentiment, transforming Sophie Cunningham from a rebellious athlete into a symbol of institutional labor exploitation. The league's punitive framework was suddenly viewed as a targeted tool to financially suppress players who demanded basic operational transparency. But the true crisis for the administration deepened when the public connected these heavy fines back to the physical reality of Caitlin Clark. For months, fans watched as opposing defenders leveled dangerous, uncalled hits against Caitlin Clark without facing any substantial administrative consequences. The fact that Sophie Cunningham was penalized thousands for mere verbal critique while physical enforcers walked away scot-free created an immediate moral disaster for the front office. The establishment was now facing a massive, uncontrolled firestorm regarding its core priorities and the actual safety of Caitlin Clark. Did the league office deliberately design this lopsided penalty structure to protect its own institutional image at the absolute expense of Caitlin Clark? What hidden administrative vulnerabilities are corporate gatekeepers so desperately trying to protect by making a severe public example out of Sophie Cunningham? The deeper analysts dive into the corporate hierarchy, the more calculated this systemic suppression begins to look. To control the narrative, high-level league officials quietly deployed a secondary wave of intimidation behind closed doors. Sources claim that league executives began placing intense back-channel pressure on corporate sponsors associated with Sophie Cunningham. They wanted to cut off the external revenue streams that allowed Sophie Cunningham to openly defy their disciplinary threats without facing immediate financial ruin. It was a ruthless, corporate strangulation tactic designed to force Sophie Cunningham back into absolute institutional compliance. Yet, this calculated corporate maneuver completely underestimated the independent media infrastructure backing Sophie Cunningham. Because Sophie Cunningham had recently signed a major digital media distribution partnership with The Volume, she possessed an uncompromised platform that the league office could not legally touch. Instead of cowering under the corporate pressure, Sophie Cunningham utilized her corporate backing to expand her public critique, turning each subsequent podcast episode into a direct challenge to league authority. Recognizing that Sophie Cunningham could not be financially intimidated, the establishment pivoted toward an entirely new tactical angle. Rumors surfaced that league officials were quietly reviewing game film to build a fabricated case of conduct detrimental to the sport against Sophie Cunningham. This legal maneuvering was designed to pave the way for an absolute, indefinite suspension that would forcibly remove Sophie Cunningham from the court and the media scrum entirely. The establishment was fully prepared to sacrifice competitive integrity just to regain control of the public narrative. But the moment this internal suspension plan leaked, the locker room chemistry across the entire league shifted dramatically. Players who had previously stayed silent began realizing that if the front office could completely erase Sophie Cunningham for speaking truth, no one was safe. A quiet coalition of veteran stars began organizing behind the scenes, planning a coordinated, league-wide protest to explicitly support Sophie Cunningham and demand a total overhaul of player safety protocols for Caitlin Clark. The brewing player mutiny presented an absolute nightmare scenario for the league's primary broadcasting partners. Television executives immediately notified the commissioner that any collective player strike or visual protest would violate multi-million-dollar distribution agreements, triggering catastrophic financial penalties. The establishment's aggressive obsession with silencing Sophie Cunningham had officially brought the entire business apparatus to the absolute brink of total structural collapse. Faced with an imminent financial catastrophe, the commissioner was forced to suspend the impending disciplinary actions against Sophie Cunningham. The league office had to completely pivot from an offensive stance of dictatorial control to a defensive strategy of chaotic damage control. But Sophie Cunningham was already fully aware that she held absolute leverage over the crumbling establishment, and she was not planning to let the front office off the hook easily. Alongside her legal representatives, Sophie Cunningham drafted a comprehensive list of operational demands that went far beyond her individual financial penalties. Sophie Cunningham demanded an independent, third-party audit of the league's entire officiating branch, pointing specifically to the repeated, unpunished fouls targeting Caitlin Clark. Furthermore, Sophie Cunningham insisted that the league implement a transparent review process where referees would be held publicly accountable for missed safety calls. The sheer audacity of the ultimatum delivered by Sophie Cunningham completely shattered the traditional top-down dynamic of professional sports governance. Never before had an individual player weaponized a social media fine to dictate structural policy changes directly to league owners. The corporate gatekeepers were trapped in a vice of their own making, forced to choose between yielding power to Sophie Cunningham or facing total financial ruin from striking players and furious networks. As the tense hours ticked away inside league headquarters, an emergency vote was called among the franchise owners to determine the final response to Sophie Cunningham. The room was deeply divided, with traditionalists demanding a hardline approach regardless of the financial fallout, while progressive owners begged for an immediate settlement. But just as the votes were being tallied, a high-ranking corporate representative from the global apparel industry walked directly into the executive suite with a shocking announcement that completely derailed the proceedings. The sudden interruption inside the boardroom completely paralyzed the room, but the look on the face of Caitlin Clark remained entirely unbothered. The global apparel brand representative who had just burst through the doors was not there to deliver a standard legal objection. He carried an emergency memo that completely turned the league's disciplinary tactics against itself. For months, the corporate establishment had assumed they could use heavy financial sanctions to isolate and silence Sophie Cunningham. What the out-of-touch executives completely failed to realize was that the massive public outcry surrounding Sophie Cunningham had caught the attention of the highest-paying commercial entities in corporate America. The global brand representative looked directly at the commissioner and announced that his corporation was prepared to pull its primary league-wide sponsorship funding if the unjust targeting of Sophie Cunningham continued. The corporate sponsors made it explicitly clear that they were entirely invested in the market growth driven by Caitlin Clark, and they had no interest in funding an institution that penalized its own stars for demanding basic workplace protection. This devastating economic threat instantly broke the hardline stance of the traditional owners, who suddenly realized that their obsessive desire for absolute control was about to bankrupt the entire league apparatus. Recognizing the total collapse of the establishment's leverage, Caitlin Clark immediately stepped forward to dictate the definitive terms of the players' victory. With the immense financial power of global corporate backing behind her, Caitlin Clark demanded that the league completely erase every single unfair penalty that had been leveled against Sophie Cunningham. The room was deathly silent as the commissioner realized he had absolutely no legal or financial ground left to stand on. The aggressive fines meant to break the spirit of Sophie Cunningham had backfired so spectacularly that the players now held absolute authority over the future of the league. The administrative surrender was finalized when the league office officially agreed to retract the fines and implement an independent review committee to oversee officiating standards. Sophie Cunningham had successfully broken the institutional wall of silence, proving to every athlete in the country that corporate scare tactics only work if the players are afraid to stand together. By refusing to back down, Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark had completely flipped the power dynamic, transforming an outdated bureaucratic system into a transparent partnership where the players finally possessed a real, uncompromised voice. The structural impact of this historic victory instantly radiated across the entire professional sports landscape, sending a clear warning to traditional gatekeepers everywhere. High-profile athletes in rival organizations began publicly praising the calculated bravery of Sophie Cunningham, citing her podcast Defiance as the ultimate blueprint for modern labor resistance. No longer would rising stars allow themselves to be financially intimidated by rigid, top-down institutions that prioritized superficial corporate optics over legitimate athlete safety and free expression. The era of the silent, fully compliant professional athlete was officially buried under a massive wave of cultural independence. Meanwhile, the commercial market responded to the player-led triumph with an unprecedented explosion of consumer engagement. The Show Me Something podcast hosted by Sophie Cunningham exploded to the absolute top of the global sports media charts, drawing millions of new subscribers who wanted to hear the unvarnished truth about the industry. Corporate brands rushed to align themselves with Sophie Cunningham, recognizing that her raw, unfiltered honesty resonated far more with younger audiences than any manufactured PR campaign ever could. The establishment's severe attempt to suppress a simple video had inadvertently created the most bankable media asset in women's basketball. This massive cultural shift completely solidified the unprecedented commercial gravity that Caitlin Clark had brought into the professional arena. By standing completely unified with Sophie Cunningham, Caitlin Clark proved that her true value extended far beyond record-shattering television ratings and sold-out stadiums. Caitlin Clark possessed the rare, generational ability to leverage her monumental fame to completely restructure the economic and legal systems governing her sport. The historic alliance between Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham had officially rewritten the boundaries of athlete power permanently. But the true long-term legacy of this boardroom victory is found in the completely transformed realities of the next generation of players. Future prospects entering professional basketball will no longer step onto the court fearing immediate financial ruination for calling out systemic failures or demanding basic referee accountability. Because Sophie Cunningham had the courage to tell the shocking truth, and because Caitlin Clark used her immense cultural leverage to back her up, the entire sport had finally stepped into the modern era. The path cleared by these two stars guaranteed that institutional transparency was no longer a luxury, it was an absolute. As the historic meeting concluded, Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark walked out of the executive suite together, met by a massive wave of national sports media reporters. The traditional owners could only watch from the windows as Sophie Cunningham proudly adjusted her headset, completely prepared to share the details of their historic victory with millions of listeners worldwide. The old corporate guard had lost the battle for control, and the new era of player independence was burning brighter than anyone in the front office ever anticipated. Yet, just as Caitlin Clark prepared to step into the team facility to celebrate the monumental shift with the rest of her teammates, a sudden, highly confidential notification flashed on her screen, revealing a hidden clause in the new corporate sponsorship contract that could completely upend their newfound independence in an instant. Do you think the league office is overstepping by repeatedly fining Sophie Cunningham for exposing the truth, or are these penalties necessary to protect the image of the sport? More importantly, is the officiating staff doing enough to protect superstars like Caitlin Clark from dangerous, physical targeting on the court, or has the establishment completely failed its biggest asset? Sound off in the comments below and let your voice be heard. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update as this historic season unfolds. The player empowerment era is officially here, don't sit on the sidelines for this one.